welcome to the Learning Experience powered by CAST. I'm one of your hosts, Kelli Suiting.
And I'm Luis Perez.
And I'm Brian Dean.
We are three educators here ready to break down barriers until learning has no limits. Let's do this. Hey friends, thanks for joining us again for yet another episode of the Learning Experience podcast. We love that you join us every month. And as always, I'm here with my pals and colleagues, Louise and Brian. Hey friends, how's it going? It's been a while.
I know, it's great to see you again, or, it's a podcast, but I am seeing you. And it's always a great conversation when we get together. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I kind of missed your faces. I haven't seen y'all in a while. Some of you have been traipsing all over the globe, and others of you have been keynoting places and doing cool stuff. So I'm just excited. As I always say, I'm feeling the cut in my strut, feeling the glide in my stride, and I'm excited to talk with Elizabeth and both of you.
Oh yeah, Brian's always bringing it in with the cool stuff. So
and that would be Kelli traveling all over the world. I've only been traveling from my kitchen to my office a lot lately. So Kelli's the world traveler here.
Traveling is not for the weak, let me tell you. I mean, there's just no way that you can be comfortable in 28 hours of flight, no matter where you go. Okay, so we're having this conversation with our guests that we've been waiting to get into the studio. So today's finally the day. So Louise and Brian, I was thinking about one of the things, we hear a lot of things, but some of the things that we hear over and over again from educators is that their students are carrying so much on their shoulders these days with stress about grades, its tests, the expectations, and everything else that comes with being a learner today. So I'm just curious, do you still feel that as you're learning new things, or in your current world, that expectations of the stress of all the things going on, and have a little conversation about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, especially Brian and I were talking before we started the recording, how like this time of the year, when we get into, I guess you could call crunch time, if you're following an academic calendar, right? It's around the time that you have things like midterms and you start thinking about final projects, or if you're at work, it's like that final sprint before our holidays here in the United States. And so it can become a little overwhelming because you start thinking about all the things you have to get done. But you just have to remember that you don't have to do them all at once.
Yeah.
You can just put together a list and just kind of go through it. And little by little, it always gets done. So it's important to just take that step back before you get too overwhelmed with things. Right, Brian?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, when I think back to first my career as in academics, and then think to now, like I've never really experienced anxiety over learning something, over the act of learning something. It's in the performance of it, right? And it's in showing that I know something even though I know it, right? Or trying to navigate that gray area of learning. Like everybody thinks that there's just this one answer, and I'm like, well, but there's so many other gray areas here, or what are the contexts? Those things always kind of trip me up, and they still do. They still do. I just took one of the big certification tests that we're trying to get through here at CAST, and I have to tell you, like, I was a nervous wreck.
Yeah.
Not because of the information. The information was great. Like, I love learning it. I'm going to apply it, and but the performance of learning has always been kind of an anxiety-filled situation for me.
Yeah, I really like how you framed it that way. And just thinking the variability of stress, right? And the learners and the situation. And so what makes it even more complex is that a lot of that stress isn't visible, right? So just like many disabilities are non-apparent. So the weight of the academic pressure isn't always something that we can see at first glance. And I think that can be difficult if we're not having conversations with our students. And that's where UDL comes in for me. Like, it gives us a framework to design our learning environments that not only support access to learning, but also reduce those unnecessary barriers that add to the stress. And so, which is just one reason why we are so thrilled to have our guest, a friend, a colleague in the field, and she's from Australia, so her accent is amazing. Elizabeth Hitches, and she's been digging into this very issue, academic stress, and it also brings a wealth of knowledge, and she has her own accessibility story and lived experience to the table, and we could not feel more honored to have you here, Elizabeth. So welcome.
Yay!
Thanks so much for having me. And I agree wholeheartedly. Friends, colleagues, accessibility advocates, and just even if we weren't doing a podcast, we would be having a chat about something. So it's absolutely wonderful to join you here today. Thank you so much for having me.
We're so excited. And one day we will meet in person. We've developed this community, these friendships and colleagues in the field virtually. So one day we're going to meet, Elizabeth. So in the meantime, can you tell us a little bit about your accessibility story and why is just accessibility and UDL important to you?
I absolutely love that question. And I wish I had a really simple accessibility story, as in, I went and became an educator and I learned everything I needed to know and then went out into the world and did it. But it didn't happen that way. So I did train as an educator, but I was never explicitly taught about accessibility. And this is despite taking units that were specifically looking at how do we support a diverse range of learners? How do we support students who might have disability in our classrooms and make it a really equitable learning experience? For some reason, accessibility didn't come up explicitly, which I find rather concerning. So when I started putting together my own resources, I went on a bit of a journey myself of thinking, how do I make this accessible for everyone? And the way that I ended up learning that was through external courses. So through taking courses with CAST, through taking courses with Vision Australia that look at how to build accessible materials, or joining the CAST cafe and having some really brilliant conversations with colleagues in that cafe environment. And it was then that I really realized how little I'd been prepared to create accessible resources in learning environments, but also when we're sharing things with colleagues. Are we making it accessible for colleagues? Are we making it accessible in our research conferences and getting our research out there in a way that everyone can access? Now, why it's so important to me and why I keep going on this journey and striving to learn new things is that I really feel that accessibility says a lot about who's been considered by default and who hasn't. Mm-hmm. And so whose voices are really valued and considered by default. If you are in a classroom environment, or you are in a staff room or even a conference setting and you don't have the same access as your peers, equitable access, you really don't feel like you've been equally valued in that setting. So for me, I want to make sure that every single learner, every single staff member that I come across feels really considered and really valued. So accessibility to me is crucial for making that happen.
I love that last phrasing, and I want to tell you to say it twice and say it twice as loud for the folks in the back. That idea of whose voices are there for accessibility, and not only that, but who's also choosing that accessibility. Like, are those voices that need to be heard for accessibility? Are they part of the conversation of what access they need? Like, that's a massive piece of accessibility that I think that for a long time maybe we haven't. While it's always kind of been there as an undercurrent, we haven't called it to the forefront. And I love that you're calling it to the forefront. That's a massive piece of it.
Yeah, and I think, Elizabeth, what I love about the way that you frame things is that when we think about accessibility, we just think about the access part, but the belonging part is equally important, yes. Right? So if we're creating environments where not only do you have access, but you feel like you belong, right? You feel like it's designed for you. And designed with you, right? Because we're big believers in co-design as well at CAST. It's a big part of our ethos. That's equally important. And so thinking about it from that perspective of like access as belonging. And one of the things that we've had conversations around is how we talk about disability, right? And the idea of non-apparent disabilities is really big because, in fact, that's often the largest number of people that are in our populations in terms of like distribution, right? And the ones that are not as like the design, they don't always come forward in terms of like being as visible. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about that idea of non-apparent disabilities. And I know you have your own lived experience that you can draw upon. And how do we do a better job of addressing both, the apparent disabilities having to do with like sensory disabilities, motor disabilities, and the like? How do we do a better job of addressing non-apparent disabilities, which is a term that I like, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
we're not invisible. We've been visible for quite some time as advocates and making noise for our, civil and human rights. And we're not hidden, like we're not hiding in, on purpose, right? So tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. And I think it's such a great distinction to make that it's not about the visibility of the person, it's that the barriers that that person experiences may be less visible to an educator or to their peers. And so these barriers can be missed because, if you can't tangibly see something like pain or fatigue or challenges with concentration, it could be so easy to miss that in the design phase. So, non apparent disabilities are really crucial for us to consider. Now, in my experience, I get to teach across a number of higher education settings, which I thoroughly enjoy. And the really great thing about that is that I get to see a really broad range of students, hundreds of students who are all studying to be educators. Now, that also means that I get to see huge numbers of students who experience both apparent and non apparent disabilities. And something I find really interesting in that higher education space is that, unlike in the schooling system, where educators are legally required to identify those barriers that students experience and put accommodations in place to reduce those barriers, when students get to higher education, that responsibility for identifying and disclosing gets put solely onto students' shoulders. So they enter into this large college or university environment, a brand new system, and yet they're the ones tasked with the responsibility of finding out what accommodations are available, finding out how they get access to them, and making that really crucial decision of whether or not to actually let their institution know formally. So I know in my classes, I have some students who have been, I've been really honoured that they've shared with me what they're experiencing while they're going through that thought process of, do I actually formally let my institution know? So in some cases, I've been the first person that they've reached out to. What this means for me in that learning environment is that I know I'm going to have some students who are registered with formal accommodations, whether or not they have apparent or non-apparent disabilities. But I'm also going to have a large group of students who are experiencing barriers to learning but don't have formal accommodations in place. Now, for me, when thinking, how do we do a better job at addressing apparent and non-apparent disability, this is where we really need to think proactively. We need to think, where are those predictable barriers to learning that I can actually reduce before the student encounters it? So, for example, I teach a number of classes that happen online, and I know that not every single student is going to be able to access that at the time that that class is happening. We might have a student who has a chronic health condition and is experiencing higher symptoms on that day. Or maybe someone's caught the flu. Or we have parents and carers and they need to support their children getting to school. Or you're on your way to class and the car breaks down. There can be so many reasons why getting to that class environment could be a barrier. So knowing that barrier without even knowing my students, I can predict that barrier and I can plan to reduce it ahead of time. So I could create a recording and make that recording accessible. I could also add closed captions to that recording because I know that some students might experience a hearing impairment. Some students might be engaging with that recording on the way home and not have their headphones available in a busy and noisy environment. So those small things that I do to reduce barriers for students with disability also have really positive impacts for all students as well.
Elizabeth, you said the small things that I do, which are so large for many of our learners, right, who've never have gotten, their lessons in their environment designed in such a way that is accessible to them. So that's pretty great. And I also really appreciate how when you started off, you also talked about staff, right? Mm-hmm. And just the access for staff as well. because that stress, like we started at the beginning, is within all of us. There's no age barrier between any type of academic stress, accommodations that we may need, and all the things. So, Bryan, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that two things actually. Elizabeth, I really love how you bridge us from these like non-apparent disabilities to just barriers in general, right? And how those help everybody. But and I know that you say these small things that you do, but it's not really the thing that you do. It is the intentionality that I think is what impresses me and would make me feel super comfortable in the classroom, is that there's an intentionality to it, that there is pre-design in that, and the outcome, you may not know who it affects, but it doesn't matter. It's that you have taken in that thought. It's like I always say, my favorite thing about teaching is the humanity of teaching, right? That's the thing that drives it, and that just kind of highlights it. And so then your research kind of comes in on this academic stress, right? And I find it fascinating. I think that it is a topic that we need to not only talk more about. I mean, everybody kind of recognizes it, but we don't talk a ton about it. But to know that there's actually somebody out there researching it, I got to know, like, what got you interested in doing that research, and why is it important to consider academic stress, and just kind of where's the research going?
Thanks so much, Bryan. It has really sparked my interest, and it's something that I've been focused on for, I think, maybe the last 5 years. It could be 5 years, really intentionally looking at academic stress. Now, for anyone who hasn't come across that particular term before, it may sound like we're talking about academics at institutions, that it's about their stress, but it's actually about the stress that students experience in their academic studies. So it's specifically about things like, as you mentioned before, concern about their learning progress, or concern about going in and having to perform in an assessment task, or even going out into a new setting and navigating a new experience. And it can look different across all different education levels. So in primary school settings, it can look more like feeling stressed that you're going to forget the activity that has just been shown to you, or forget how to do it. Whereas when you get to college and uni, it could also be, how do I manage living on a campus and managing a new system and this new independence? So stresses can look different at different levels, and what stresses you may not stress me, and vice versa. It's all about our demands that we're facing, the resources that we have, and then whether or not we have the resources to cope with those demands. Yeah, so what really interested me getting into the higher education space is having a look at that transition for students between maybe high schools and then heading into that college and university setting, where there's so much more responsibility on them in that accommodation process. So my research started out looking at higher education students and looking at their experiences of seeking support at university, going through accommodation processes, and wanting to see, was there a difference in stress levels between those who had a disability versus those who didn't, and also between those who did seek accommodations and those who did not. Now, what we somewhat expected was that if a student experienced a disability, there could be a higher level of academic stress, because we know that students are experiencing more barriers in our educational environments when they're not designed for a diverse range of learners. But what we didn't expect, and what really drove this research forward, is that when we had a look at students who had sought accommodations and those who hadn't, we didn't see a statistically significant difference in the level of stress that they were reporting. So whether or not they went through that sometimes quite emotional process of disclosing to an institution and going through a really unknown process of developing accommodations in a new setting, whether or not they went through that process, their stress levels didn't seem to differ. The question then is why? Why is that not making a quantitative difference in stress? Why can't we see it in the numbers? And that's where we did a deeper dive. So what is it that students are experiencing across both of those pathways? And what's really coming out in the research is that regardless of which pathway you take, accommodations or no accommodations, there are different stresses or different barriers down both of those pathways that increase your stress compared to others. But what I also find really interesting and empowering for anyone in an education space is that a number of those barriers are unnecessary. They don't need to be there. So to me, that says with really clever design, we can hopefully reduce some of those stresses, and we might actually be able to reduce some of that academic stress that students are experiencing.
I have to ask though, like a little bit of stress, like stress is good too though, isn't it? Like it's not just like any kind of stress. Oh no, it's going to have this negative impact. Like
Absolutely.
Sometimes I think stress is good, right? Like it pushes us, it forces us to kind of open up the scheme of what we know and find new pathways to finding our own barriers and advocating for ourselves and things like that. So how do you find a balance in that?
It's a really great question. And I think what's out there in the research can support us in this. And that's showing that if we have a little bit of stress, that can actually be something that's quite motivating. Maybe you've got an assessment coming up, and that little bit of stress is what gets you going to make a start on that assessment and put your best work forward. Or prompts you to create that to-do list, as Luis mentioned, and start chipping away at some of those tasks. But what we see is that if students have a high level of stress, it can hit a point where it stops being really productive and supportive of that learning experience and shifts into something that actually impacts on students' capacity to learn. And what really interests me and scares me is that it can have very significant impacts on mental health and also physical health. Now, we know that there are some chronic health conditions that if students do experience high levels of stress, it can actually impact those health conditions and cause those symptoms to actually be more pronounced or to make them worse. So any unnecessary stresses are something that we really need to be thinking about reducing so that students can experience those really great learning challenges and those positive stresses that really drive their learning forward, but don't impact it in a negative way.
Yeah, I mean, I think to Brian's point, I used to be an athlete. Hard to believe now looking at my dad bod. But back in the day, I knew that before a game, if I didn't feel a certain level of butterflies, like if I didn't feel some sort of anticipation, it was not going to be a good game. So you do need a little bit of sort of stress because it energizes you and it primes you for performance. But once the game started, like I need to focus on the task at hand and like just focus on the skill that I'm trying to perform and not like, am I not going to be good enough? And those kinds of things that then in the background kind of impact your performance. So it's finding that balance between like the stress that kind of activates you and motivates you and the one that kind of causes you to freeze. The other thing that I thought about, as you mentioned with the issue of accommodations, I used to spend so much time trying to hide that I had a visual impairment by not using a white cane. And that was a lot of energy that I was, just putting forth and just trying to hide that I had a disability, since we're talking about apparent, non-apparent, and so on. But once I started using my white cane, which, by the way, a symbol of freedom, right? It gives you the ability to navigate environments with much more confidence. It was like a lot of that stress was lifted of like, now I'm just, free to be myself and feel like I belong and can navigate with confidence and avoid awkward situations too, where you bump into somebody. And so I think your findings around accommodations, like that it can at times put a lot of emphasis on like time management, right? Because sometimes you have to manage things like attendance and note takers and so on. But at the same time, it can also lessen the stress because it does free you to do the thing that you're there to do. At uni, which I love that term. We should call it uni here in the U.S. too. It's much more friendly term than, academia.
Right. So maybe that there's a emphasis on an internal stress. Like it seems like there's what you're talking about, Louise, is a social stress and being freed from that. And then there is the stress of everyday minutia and mechanics of, working out the other accommodations that you need. Not that one is more productive than the other. Is it really more about the perseveration on those things, right? Because I know where I end up going with my my neurodivergent mind. Like I just spiral, and I start thinking, okay, I need to do this. And really, writing is not just a task; it is a checklist of 6 things I have to do in order to start writing. And now, how am I going to do that? And I only have 20 minutes to do this. And am I going to be able to get everything in? And even now, I can feel like I'm talking like I'm spiraling, right? So I wonder if there's any indication or if there's anything that's been looked at in kind of in that way, Elizabeth, in your research around is this internal stress of like, is this a societal stress or is this an academic stress or executive functioning stress?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's really coming out is that there are so many different types of stresses or different sources of stress for students. So we've had some students talking about assessment design, and particularly for students who are experiencing ADHD, they've been mentioning reading about assessment guidelines and feeling like they have to read between the lines, that there's something implied in that assessment, and they are spending time stressing about, am I actually interpreting this assessment the right way before I even get started? And that's causing stress. We have some other students who are talking about perhaps experiencing a physical disability or a chronic health condition that impacts their energy levels. And for them, getting to that class is a stress. They're thinking, this campus has a lot of hills. I have to set off early. I have to find my way from my car parking space up the hill to the classroom. And then this classroom, by the time I get there, I'm going to need a rest before I then go into that space. So these stresses can look so individual and so unique to individual people's experiences and circumstances. We also have seen some students who are mature age students saying that one of their stresses is actually around belonging, feeling like they're in group assessments with people who they're not as well connected with. They don't have that easy access into that group that feels like it's already established. And so even that sense of, do I belong in this space when I don't see many people like me here? There's not a huge amount of representation of people like me. Do I fit? That is actually a stressor. So as you mentioned, it can be the academic side of stress. It can be that social learning side of stress. But what really interests me, those things that we can really impact, is when I see students talking about accessibility barriers being a stressor. So students saying, I've gone through the accommodation process, but by the time my resources were available to me, it was 3 weeks into the course. So I'm getting access 3 weeks later than my peers. Somehow I've got to catch up on 3 weeks' work and the assessment's due next week.
Yeah, not only catch up on it, but also maintain where everything is right now.
Absolutely.
Right? That's massive. Yeah.
And those things really speak to why we're seeing that high level of stress for students with disability, because there are still so many barriers there that really shouldn't be there. Things that should be fixed with really clever and equitable design, applying a UDL approach, making sure that everybody has access to materials. That barrier, that stressor could be reduced very quickly.
100%. And Elizabeth, I so appreciate your approach in design for those predictable barriers, right? I appreciate your research and your mindset that clearly your students feel because they're leaning into you and sharing, and you're giving them a safe space, right? And I feel like, that's the entry point is that sort of, designing for those predictable barriers, creating that space, being welcoming and belonging. And I wish I could observe your classroom. And I feel like one of your classrooms, but I feel like our listeners are going to learn so much from you. And so with that said, from your current research that I'm sure is never ending, could you share like a couple actionable steps that educators can take to reduce academic stress for their students?
I just want to put a caveat here that I am learning all the time. And every time I create a learning experience, I reflect on it, I see new barriers, and then I have to work to reduce those. So it is an ongoing, enjoyable experience of making things more and more accessible over time. So there's never a perfect lesson, but there are always things we can do to keep improving it. So in terms of
Say
how
that
we might be
again.
able to
Say that part again too, Elizabeth. There's never a perfect lesson. There's just
That's it. And
improvement upon it.
I am a
That's
perfectionist,
free.
so
That
it's something
reduces the
I've had to
stress of an
learn.
educator. Yeah, that reduces the stress of an educator, though, right? Like we how many educators chase this idea that they have to have the perfect lesson? That I thought
Thanks,
was
Bryan.
important.
And yeah, I feel the same because, I can look back on previous things that I've taught and see some really obvious barriers and really, really cringe at my past self. And all I think of is in those moments when I cringe at what my past self has done, instead of feeling the negative aspect of reflection, reflect on how far I've come and reflect on how much I know now and how much I can use that to push forward. So for anyone out there cringing at their own learning experiences, take that as a moment to really see how far you've grown. It's a positive thing to see growth. So in terms of thinking about how to reduce accessibility barriers, how to reduce stresses, we really need to start thinking about the predictable barriers. And when I've been co-designing with students and staff, thinking about what we do about academic stress, we're seeing these high levels, but what do we do about it? One of the key things that's coming out is we can't just treat stress. We can't treat high stress once it's happened. That can't be the only option. We need to be looking at how we reduce those stresses or those barriers in the first place. And one of the key things that students are talking about are things like accessibility barriers. So an actionable step could be having a look at what predictable barriers might be in your learning resources. Are you putting out PowerPoint slides and haven't yet used the accessibility checker? Go try out the accessibility checker on PowerPoint. Or if you're creating a printout resource, so it's a printout piece of paper, think about also opening up options like having a digital version that is accessible and all students have access to that too. Think about what barriers could be in the way and start to plan ahead and proactively reduce those barriers through inclusive design. And I'd love us to remember that when we're doing this, we may not only be increasing accessibility, we might also be reducing some of those stresses, which can help support our students' mental health. So it's like a 2-for-1. You reduce a barrier, you could increase accessibility and potentially reduce some stress too.
I love that. It always makes me think, I used to compare like behaviors with like the domino effect. And when we set up dominoes, right, like the building blocks, and you set the first one up, and then you set these blocks all in a row, and then you push the first one down and all the other blocks fall. And then to set them back up, you have to go back to that very first one, which is the core behavior, the core reason, or the barrier. Because once that barrier's there, if we're only picking up the blocks after all these other stresses that are happening, if that barrier's still there, we cannot support our learners. So it's like that predictable barrier is that first domino. We have to find out what's the core, what's happening there, so we can get them all set back up. I'm just really excited about this. I'm just like, I wish I had you.
Can I go back to a point that was made earlier too, Elizabeth? I think we talked about educator stress too, so I want to make sure that we bring that back up here. And I think at times we as educators feel like we have to do all the work. When in fact, sometimes what we need to do is listen to students and set up opportunities where they can tell us what's working and what's not, what's causing them stress and what's not. So that's why we so emphasize, you've been part of some of our learning experiences, the power of reflection, right? The power of having exit tickets or final reflections where students can tell you not only like what's going on in terms of the content, but what's going on with them, right? Like, are they stressed, or are there barriers that are causing them stress? We can ask these things. We don't have to figure it out like by magic. Like we have to be guessers. No, we can be, much more proactive in placing these opportunities for reflection into our design, so that we're co-designing, right? Because we're finding out from people what they need and what they prefer, and that can reduce stress too, right? Being heard sometimes it's a really important part of it. So I don't know, Bryan, if you want to add to that, because I know you do a lot of work as an instructional designer as well.
Yeah. Well, and I think that even just as an instructor, period, right, or just working along that, right, like there is this notion that you are standing up in front of 35 young faces who will believe just about anything you say, right, and so you must have all the answers, when in fact you don't. right? So you as an educator have set yourself up, or the system has set you up, or whatever the case is. The bottom line is there is this stress of performance. There is this stress of knowledge, right? When we can easily say, that's a predictable barrier to say as an educator, I don't have all the answers, but we can co-design this. Or if I'm not understanding what your barrier is, let's open up and have some conversation about it so that we can try to figure it out. Like once I started doing that, though I didn't really realize I was doing that. Once I started doing that, like teaching became a joy again.
That's
Because
that's the goal, right?
Yeah, because it wasn't performance all the time. It was like discovery, right?
Absolutely.
And it wasn't my own performance as an instructor. It was about sharing what I knew, and just being a little bit further down the road as far as the knowledge went, and sharing that with my students. And so that just lifted so much off of me. And I think, Louise, that's what you're saying, and I think, Elizabeth, that's what you're saying, and I'm 100% behind that.
So, Elizabeth, we've been talking a lot about stress, but you yourself personally, so to end on a fun question, what do you do to de-stress personally? What keeps you sort of like going as an educator? Because I'm sure you're pretty busy and have your own set of stresses with all the work that you do in research and pursuing higher education. What do you do to sort of maintain a good level of stress?
It's just so important when you might be in roles like being an educator, where you are giving so much energy to find those things that top up your cup and fill that energy cup back up. And so I'm going to go through this sequentially in my mind. So I'm thinking, if I'm collecting feedback, collecting that student voice and using it to drive my education processes further, I want to be thinking about not just the barriers, but also what are the enablers to positive learning experiences? What are the good things that happen? So when you seek that student voice, seek both. Find out what is working well so that you keep doing it. It doesn't get designed out of the experience if something's really working and people are enjoying it. But it also gives you something to reflect back on. You get to see that something's working well and see some of the impacts, which aren't always tangible. You know, people can be really quick to complain, but slower to compliment. So find those opportunities to see where are things really working well and compliment yourself on a job well done when you see those moments. Now, when I step away from work and when I step away from study, which work and study is a source of joy, so it replenishes as much as it drains. But outside of work, I'm really trying to get more into cooking and trying to cook things from places that I haven't been exposed to. So I'm really trying to, I don't know, what would you say? Explore the world in a culinary sense. So that is my de-stress.
That's cool.
To test out new things, test out new flavors, that just because of where I live or who I have contact with, I may not have gotten to experience yet. So that's a really exciting de-stressor for me, is finding something amazing out there that I otherwise wouldn't have had exposure to.
Do you have a favorite that you've discovered in your journey of de-stressing yourself?
Oh, that is such a good one. Do you know, I discovered really recently these really great rice paper wraps. I think the origin is Thailand. And they've got mango, they've got mint, they've got like white beans, and there's just so many things in there. A combination I would not have put together myself, and yet they were incredible. And we're coming into summer here, the best summer food ever. So that's a great one.
Oh, you had me at mango.
Mango. Yeah, me too. Mangoes are the best.
Well, Kelli, I know Kelli is also a foodie, so I'm guessing that food
I am
will
a
be
foodie.
involved, and probably the outdoors, because don't you like camping as well and being outdoors?
Yes.
And cage fighting. I thought you were really into cage fighting too. Like you had just started to pick that up and said that was a great way to de-stress. So.
That was September. This is a different month.
Oh, okay, right on. I got you. Right on.
Yes, I am definitely a foodie. I love food trucks, and so I am a self-proclaimed food truck chaser. So that's me. De-stressing, find food, enjoy the good music around a food truck.
For me, it's nature. It's spending time in nature. So just about every weekend, I'll be out in nature and taking photos and just walking around and getting some fresh air and some sunlight. that, to your point about educators needing to fill up their cup, that's what fills up my cup, so that come Monday morning, I can be there and I can be present and be the best that I can be for the people that I serve. How about you, Bryan?
Recently, I've been getting really into competitive poodle trimmings. So like trimming them for dog shows and whatnot. I'm not very good at it. I don't have a lot of repeat customers, but that's been a de-stressor. I'm really trying to work on the lion cut right now. So that'll be my next big thing, I think.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, we can't wait to put the pictures of your latest clients.
You don't want to see them now. No, you don't want to see them now. No.
I'm really tempted to ask for a haircut and just see what I get. Do you do people by any chance?
You're brave. You are so brave, Elizabeth. You are so brave.
You have seen his own hair, right, Elizabeth?
Or lack thereof.
I wasn't going to say.
Yeah, but both Bryan and I have very easy maintenance when it comes to our hairstyles.
Yeah. And I'd like to think that both Louise and I have great shaped heads. So it really works for us.
On that note, mangoes, food, haircuts, poodles. That should be in our description.
That's
Elizabeth,
right.
You have been such a joy. We're so grateful that you are 15 hours ahead of us, I think, if we calculated right, or something like that. So
something like that.
We're so glad. Yeah, something I can't even wrap my mind around half the time. But we're so grateful that you took the time to have this conversation with us. And we just look forward to your further resources and research and seeing you at the Cast Cafe. And we would love to share some of your research in the show notes for you. Is there a certain place where our listeners can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So Google Scholar is a place where the research gets loaded up as soon as it's available. So you can Google Scholar me. My name's Elizabeth Hitches. That will be in the show notes. I'll also put some links in to some of the recent papers that I've mentioned about looking at those comparisons of stress across different student groups. There are going to be some updated ones coming out in the very near future. So if you keep an eye on Google Scholar, they should appear over the next few months.
And give us a plug. Give us a plug for the podcast.
The A Lot of Things podcast. That is ILOTA Things, THINGS. It's out of ADSET in Australia, and we look specifically at applying UDL and accessibility, but through an AI lens. So what does it look like in an AI world or an AI landscape? Thanks, Bryan, for the for the recommendation.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us from the future, Elizabeth. Literally, you're a day ahead, I think. So you're just starting out your morning. So this has been a great way, we hope, to start your day, and a great way for us to end our day here. Always a pleasure working with you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Learning Experience Podcast. We are so glad you're a part of this conversation.
And if you're like me and today's episode sparked some ideas or got your brain flowing, well, just remember there's so much more to explore out there.
And remember that CAST is leading the way when it comes to accessibility, workforce innovation, professional development, and research.
So visit cast.org to dive deeper. That's CAST.org, and keep learning with us.